In 1847, a watchmaker in Geneva received a commission that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The client wanted a pocket watch, nothing unusual there, but the specifications were different. The watch needed to track something other than time. When the watchmaker asked what exactly, the client smiled and said, "You'll know when you finish it." 3 months later, the watchmaker delivered the piece. That night, he watched through his workshop window as the client stood in the street holding the watch open under moonlight. The hands moved, but not forward. They spun backward, then stopped, then pointed to directions that had nothing to do with time. The watchmaker never spoke of it again. But the watch survived, and so did dozens of others just like it. These are the pocket watches that collectors won't talk about. The ones that antique dealers used to sell in back rooms, never displayed in windows. The ones with hands that allegedly moved on their own after midnight, pointing to places, dates, or coordinates that shouldn't exist. There was one dealer who specialized in these pieces. He operated out of a shop in Edinburgh until 2003. Then he disappeared. His inventory vanished with him. But before he left, 12 customers came forward with the same story. Their watches did something at night, something impossible. If you're here for the full mystery, hit subscribe. You'll want to see where this goes. I cover suppressed history, lost technology, and the artifacts they don't want you asking about every week. Now, what did those watch hands actually do? To understand what owners reported, you need to understand what these watches were supposed to be. Pre-1880 pocket watches weren't just timekeeping devices. They were precision instruments. Many included complications, phases of the moon, perpetual calendars, equation of time. But the watches in question had no complications listed in their documentation. According to their cases and papers, they were simple time-only pieces, except they weren't. The first documented case comes from 1893. A Scottish landowner named William Craigie purchased a pocket watch at an estate sale in Inverness. The watch dated to 1860. Gold case, white enamel dial, Roman numerals, nothing remarkable. Craigie wore it for 3 weeks without incident. Then one night he woke at 2:47 a.m. He didn't know why. The house was silent, but something felt wrong. He reached for the watch on his bedside table. It was open. He never left it open. And the hands were moving, not ticking forward like a normal watch, spinning, slowly, counterclockwise. As Craigie watched, the minute hand completed a full reverse rotation, then stopped. Both hands pointed to 4 and 12. 4 o'clock. Craigie closed the watch, set it down, and tried to sleep. At 4 a.m. exactly, he was jolted awake by a crash downstairs. A bookshelf had collapsed. No explanation. The brackets were still mounted to the wall. The shelf itself had split down the middle. He sold the watch 2 days later. The buyer was a surgeon in Edinburgh named Dr. James Abernathy. Abernathy didn't believe Craigie's story. He thought the man had simply experienced a coincidence and a nightmare. So Abernathy wore the watch daily and kept detailed notes. For 6 weeks, nothing happened. Then, on a Tuesday in December, Abernathy attended a dinner party. He placed his watch on the mantel. At 9:15 p.m, another guest noticed the watch was open. She asked Abernathy if he'd opened it. He hadn't. She pointed to the face. The hands were moving, not spinning this time, twitching, the hour hand pointing northwest, the minute hand northeast, like a compass. Abernathy closed the watch and pocketed it. But later that night, he tested something. He opened the watch at 11 p.m, set it on his desk and watched. At 11:47 the hands moved again. Same direction, northwest and northeast. He took out a compass. The hour hand aligned almost perfectly with magnetic north. The minute hand pointed 23 degrees east of north. That direction from his home led to Holyrood Palace. Abernathy never discovered why, but he kept the watch for 2 more years, documenting every instance of movement. According to his journals, the hands pointed to Holyrood Palace on 17 separate occasions, always between the hours of 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., always when the watch was left open. On the 18th occurrence, Abernathy took the watch to the palace. He stood outside the gates at midnight, watch open in his palm. The hands moved, but this time they pointed south. away from the palace, toward the Royal Mile. Abernathy followed the direction. 6 blocks south, the hands shifted, pointed west. He followed again. The hands kept redirecting him block by block until he arrived at the ruins of an old chapel foundation. Construction workers had uncovered it 3 days earlier while excavating for a new building. The site dated to the 1500s. Abernathy stood at the edge of the excavation, watch in hand. The hands stopped moving, both pointed straight down. The next morning he donated the watch to a museum, anonymously. He never explained why. His journals were found after his death in 1904, locked in a desk drawer with a note that read, "Some directions are not meant to be followed." The watch disappeared from museum records in 1910. But it wasn't the only one. Between 1860 and 1880, at least 43 pocket watches were produced with similar behaviour. We know this because of a watchmaker's ledger discovered in 2001 in a Geneva archive. The ledger listed custom commissions. Most entries were standard: client name, specifications, delivery date. But 7 entries were marked with a red symbol in the margin, a circle with a line through it. Next to these entries, the watchmaker had written a single word: aligned. The 7 watches were commissioned by different clients across Europe: a banker in Vienna, a professor in Paris, a shipbuilder in Liverpool, a cartographer in Prague, a physician in Berlin, an architect in Brussels, and a merchant in London. None of the clients were connected as far as records show, but all 7 watches were completed between March and October of 1867, and all 7 were reported to move at night. The Vienna banker, Franz Leitner, kept a diary. In July of 1868 he wrote, "The watch has begun its dance again, 3 nights this week. The hands do not keep time, they keep something else. Last night they pointed east for 20 minutes, then stopped at 9 and 3. I do not know what this means. I am afraid to find out." 2 weeks later, Leitner's diary entries stopped. His final entry, dated August 4th, read, "It pointed to the cathedral. I went. I should not have gone." Leitner died 3 days later. The official cause was listed as heart failure. He was 31 years old. The watch was inherited by his brother, who sold it within a month. The buyer's name was not recorded. The Paris professor Émile Rochefort fared slightly better. He owned his watch for 4 years and documented over 60 instances of hand movement. Unlike Abernathy, Rochefort believed the watches were responding to geomagnetic fields. He theorized that certain locations produced magnetic anomalies that affected the watch mechanisms, causing the hands to point toward these sites. Rochefort tested his theory. He brought the watch to known magnetic anomaly sites around France: caves with high iron content, ancient standing stones, old mines. In every location the watch hands moved, but they didn't point to the source of the anomaly. They pointed away from it, towards something else. In his notes, Rochefort wrote, "The watch does not react to the magnetic field. It reacts to something the magnetic field conceals. I have begun to suspect these sites are markers. The watch is not pointing to them. It is pointing through them." Rochefort presented his findings to the French Academy of Sciences in 1872. His paper was rejected. The Academy's official response stated, "The claims are unsubstantiated and border on spiritualism, which has no place in scientific discourse." Rochefort destroyed his research and stopped wearing the watch. He died in 1889. The watch was sold at his estate auction to an unknown buyer. 3 of the original 7 watches resurfaced in the 1920s. A watch dealer in London acquired them from separate sources. He displayed them in his shop, marketing them as mystery watches with unusual provenance. For 2 years they sat in the display case without issue. Then a customer named Edward Pritchard purchased all 3 at once. Pritchard was a surveyor and amateur archaeologist. He'd read about the watches in a journal article and tracked them down specifically. He wanted to test whether the watches pointed to archaeological sites. For 6 months, Pritchard carried all 3 watches on his surveys across southern England. He documented their behaviour meticulously. His conclusion: The watches didn't point to archaeological sites. They pointed to locations where archaeological sites used to be, places that had been excavated, destroyed, or built over. One watch consistently pointed to a field in Somerset. Records showed a Roman villa had stood there until it was demolished in 1704. Another watch pointed to a location in Kent where a medieval monastery was torn down in 1538. But the third watch pointed to something that shouldn't exist. In October of 1927, Pritchard was surveying a site in central London where a new bank was being constructed. Workers had dug down 12 feet for the foundation, standard excavation. Nothing unusual discovered. But when Pritchard opened the third watch at the site, both hands snapped to the same position. Straight down, 6 o'clock. Pritchard convinced the foreman to dig deeper, another 6 feet. They found stone, carved stone, a foundation that wasn't on any map or record. The style dated it to pre-Norman construction, possibly Saxon, possibly older. The foreman ordered the excavation stopped and the foundation covered. The bank was built on schedule. Pritchard's survey notes were filed away. He tried to publish his findings. No journal would accept them. He died in 1933. The 3 watches were sold to a private collector whose name was never made public. This is where the story gets deliberately obscured. For 50 years the watches disappeared from public record. No auctions, no museum acquisitions, no sales. It's as if someone actively removed them from circulation. But in 1981, one of them appeared at a small antique shop in Edinburgh. The shop was owned by a man named Malcolm Daventry. And Daventry wasn't just a dealer, he was a researcher. Daventry had spent 20 years tracking pre-1880 pocket watches with unusual histories. He'd compiled a list of over 70 watches that allegedly moved, pointed, or behaved abnormally. Most were lost or destroyed, but Daventry had acquired 6 of them. He kept them in a locked case in the back of his shop. He never displayed them publicly, and he only sold them to buyers who understood what they were purchasing. Between 1981 and 2003, Daventry sold 11 watches. Not all were from his personal collection. Some he sourced through private sales and estate auctions. Each time he sold one, he required the buyer to sign a document. The document stated that the buyer acknowledged the watch's non-standard properties and agreed to report any significant observations back to Daventry. 12 buyers signed, 12 watches were sold, and 12 buyers reported the same thing. The watches moved at night, but only when certain conditions were met. The first condition was lunar phase. The watches were most active during the new moon and full moon. On nights between these phases, the watches remained still. The second condition was location. The watches only moved in specific areas, cities, old cities, places with histories that stretch back centuries. The third condition was orientation. The watch had to be left open, face up, in darkness. When all 3 conditions were met, the watches would activate between midnight and 3 a.m. The hands would move, and they would point. But here's what's disturbing. According to the 12 buyers, the watches didn't point to the same locations. Each watch had its own target, its own direction. One pointed toward Edinburgh Castle, one toward a church in Prague, one toward a specific intersection in Vienna, one toward a bridge in Paris, one toward a section of the Thames in London, and one pointed to a building that didn't exist. In 1998, a buyer named Catherine Morris purchased a watch from Daventry. Morris was a historian specialising in urban development. She bought the watch out of curiosity, not belief, but she agreed to Daventry's terms and took the watch home to her flat in Edinburgh's Old Town. The first night, nothing happened. Morris left the watch open on her desk during the new moon. She stayed awake until 2 a.m. The watch remained still. She assumed Daventry's claims were exaggerated, but she tried again during the next new moon. At 1:34 a.m. the minute hand moved, just slightly. A tremor, then it swung to the left and stopped. The hour hand followed. Both hands pointed northwest. Morris took a compass reading. The direction led to a specific spot 3 blocks away. She marked it on a map. For the next year, Morris documented the watch's behaviour. Every new moon and full moon, the watch pointed to the same location, always at night, always between 1 Pakwan and 3 Fwyd a.m. Morris researched the location. According to city records, it was an empty lot, no buildings, no structures, nothing of historical significance. But older maps told a different story. In 1650, a church stood at that location. It was demolished in 1688 during the Glorious Revolution. The stones were scattered. The foundation was filled in. For over 300 years, the site remained empty. By the time Morris began her research, the lot was scheduled for development. A hotel was planned. Morris contacted the developers and requested access to the site before construction began. She wanted to survey the ground. The developers agreed. In April of 2000, Morris and a small team used ground-penetrating radar on the lot. They found something. 12 feet below street level there was a void, a chamber. The walls were intact. The roof hadn't collapsed. Whatever was down there had been deliberately sealed and buried. Morris filed a request with the city to excavate. The request was denied. The reason given, no historical significance warranted. Construction on the hotel began in June. The foundation was poured over the site. The chamber, whatever it was, is now under 4 floors of hotel rooms. Morris kept the watch. She continued monitoring it. But after the hotel was built, the watch stopped pointing. The hands never moved again. She reported this to Daventry. His response, according to Morris, was, "That's what they do. They point until the location is disturbed, then they go silent. You've documented something that no longer exists." Morris sold the watch back to Daventry in 2001. It was the last watch he ever sold. In 2003, Malcolm Daventry closed his shop. No announcement, no sale. He simply locked the door one evening and never returned. His inventory disappeared. His research files were gone. His home was cleared out. Neighbours reported seeing a moving truck in the middle of the night, but no one knew where Daventry went. He left no forwarding address, no contact information, no explanation. Attempts to locate him failed. He wasn't dead. He hadn't emigrated. He simply vanished. And so did the remaining watches in his collection. But before he left, Daventry sent letters to the 12 buyers. The letters were brief. Most contained a single sentence. "Stop using the watches. Destroy them if you can. Do not try to contact me." 11 of the buyers received the letters. One did not. That buyer's name was Thomas Harwell. Harwell had purchased a watch from Daventry in 1999. Unlike the other buyers, Harwell wasn't a historian or researcher. He was a contractor. He bought the watch because he liked old things. He didn't take Daventry's warning seriously. When the watch started moving at night, Harwell thought it was amusing. He showed it to friends at pubs. He posted about it online. He treated it like a party trick. Then, in November of 2003, the watch pointed to his own home. Harwell lived in a renovated Georgian townhouse in Edinburgh. The building dated to 1780. He'd owned it for 5 years. Nothing unusual had ever happened there. But on the night of November 14th, Harwell left the watch open on his kitchen table during a full moon. At 2:22 a.m. he woke to a sound downstairs, a tapping, rhythmic. He went to investigate. The watch was on the floor. The hands were spinning. Not ticking, spinning. Both hands rotating counterclockwise, faster than any mechanical watch should move. Harwell picked it up. The moment he touched it, the hands stopped. Both pointed straight down. 6 o'clock, toward the floor. Harwell lived on the ground floor. Below him was a basement he used for storage. He'd been down there 100 times. Nothing strange, just old furniture and boxes. But that night, Harwell went down with a flashlight. He examined the floor. Stone, original to the building. He tapped it with his foot. One section sounded different. Hollow. Harwell removed the stones. Underneath was dirt. He dug down 2 feet and hit wood. A wooden cover. He pried it open. Below was a shaft, narrow, maybe 3 feet wide. It dropped into darkness. Harwell shone his flashlight down. He couldn't see the bottom. He didn't go down. He replaced the cover, filled in the dirt, and put the stones back. He brought the watch upstairs and locked it in a drawer. He never opened it again. 3 days later, Harwell received a call. The caller didn't identify themselves. The voice was male, calm, and specific. The caller said, "You found something you weren't meant to find. Sell the property. Relocate. Do not discuss what you discovered." Harwell asked who was calling. The line went dead. Harwell sold the townhouse in 2004. He moved to Glasgow. He sold the watch to a private collector in London for an undisclosed sum. He refused to speak about the shaft or what the watch had pointed to. When contacted for this research, Harwell's response was, "I don't know what was down there. I don't want to know, and neither do you." The watch's current location is unknown, but here's the question that no one has answered. What were these watches designed to find? The standard explanation, the one offered by skeptics, is that the watches were elaborate hoaxes, mechanical tricks, magnets hidden in the cases, weighted hands that shifted when the watch was tilted, clever craftsmanship designed to fool buyers. And sure, that explains some cases. There are known examples of trick watches from the 19th century. Watches with hidden compartments, watches with false faces, watches designed to deceive. But the documented cases, the ones with multiple witnesses, the ones with consistent behavior over years, don't fit that pattern. Hoax watches reveal themselves quickly. The mechanism fails, the trick becomes obvious. But these watches functioned for decades. They pointed to locations that their owners had never visited. They responded to lunar phases and geomagnetic conditions that their makers couldn't have predicted. So if they weren't hoaxes, what were they? One theory comes from the ledger entry, aligned. The word suggests calibration. These watches were aligned to something, but to what? Standard watches are aligned to time, regulated by a balance wheel and escapement. But if these watches were aligned to locations, to directions, to coordinates, then they weren't measuring time. They were measuring space, or, more specifically, they were measuring where space used to be. Consider the pattern. The watches pointed to demolished buildings, buried foundations, sites that had been deliberately erased from the landscape. Churches torn down during the Reformation, monasteries dissolved under Henry VIII, Roman structures built over during medieval expansion. Each location had been significant once. Then it was removed, hidden, forgotten. But the watches remembered. This brings us to the question of who commissioned them. The 7 watches in the Geneva Ledger were ordered by clients across Europe in 1867. That year is significant. 1867 was the year of the Second Reform Act in Britain, the year of the Paris Exposition, the year of the Austro-Hungarian Compromise. It was a time of political reorganization, industrial expansion, and urban renewal. Old cities were being torn down and rebuilt. Ancient structures were being demolished to make room for progress. And in the middle of that transformation, 7 people commissioned watches that pointed to what was being destroyed. Were they preservationists, archaeologists, collectors trying to document what was being lost? Or were they looking for something specific, something buried beneath the old structures? There's a document. It surfaced in 2007 at an estate sale in Switzerland. A letter dated October 1866, written in French. The letter was addressed to a watchmaker in Geneva. It requested a directional chronometer capable of maintaining alignment with fixed geospatial coordinates independent of temporal progression. The letter specified that the mechanism should activate nocturnally and respond to lunar phases. The signature at the bottom was illegible, but the return address was a building in Vienna that no longer exists. The building was demolished in 1891. City records show it was owned by a private scientific society. The society's name, the Order of Persistent Foundations. No other records of this organization have been found, but the name is revealing. Persistent foundations, foundations that persist, foundations that remain even after the structures above them are gone. This suggests the watches weren't pointing to buildings, they were pointing to what was beneath the buildings, to foundations, to whatever had been built into the foundations, to whatever was still there, underground, undisturbed. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. In 1889, during the construction of the Paris metro, workers discovered a chamber 20 feet below street level. The chamber was circular, 12 feet in diameter, with walls made of fitted stone, no mortar. The stones were carved with symbols that didn't match any known language. In the center of the chamber was a stone plinth. On the plinth was a metal disc about 8 inches in diameter, inscribed with radiating lines and geometric patterns. The chief engineer filed a report. He described the chamber as pre-Roman, possibly Celtic, purpose unknown. The report recommended further excavation and study. The recommendation was denied. The chamber was sealed with concrete. The metro tunnel was rerouted. The location was classified. The engineer's report was archived and forgotten. Until 1994, when a researcher found a copy in a private collection. The researcher noticed something. The location of the chamber matched one of the watches, the pocket watch owned by Emile Rochefort, the Paris professor. The watch that pointed through magnetic anomalies, the direction it pointed led directly to the sealed chamber. Rochefort died in 1889, the same year the chamber was discovered and sealed. Coincidence? Maybe. But there's another case. In 1902, workers digging the foundation for a bank in London uncovered a stone structure. The structure was older than Roman London. Carbon dating, done years later on samples from the site, suggested it was built around 800 BCE. The structure was a spiral staircase, carved into bedrock. It descended 40 feet underground and ended at a sealed door. The door was made of stone, fitted so precisely that no gaps existed between the door and the frame. The workers reported the discovery to the bank's management. Management reported it to the city. The city sent an inspector. The inspector's report stated, "Structure is of unknown origin and poses no threat to construction. Recommendation, fill and continue." The staircase was filled with rubble and concrete. The bank was built on top. But before the staircase was sealed, 3 people went down. One was the inspector. One was a city surveyor. And one was a man identified in records only as a concerned party with interest in antiquarian structures. The concerned party brought a pocket watch. According to the surveyor's notes, the watch activated when they reached the sealed door. The hands moved, both pointed at the door. The concerned party opened the watch cover and held it against the stone. The surveyor wrote, "The watch face grew warm to the touch." The concerned party stated this confirmed the site's alignment. He requested the door remain undisturbed. The inspector agreed. The door was never opened. The staircase was filled the next day. The concerned party's identity was never recorded, but his watch was. The description matches one of the original 7 from the Geneva ledger. The watch commissioned by the London merchant in 1867. What was behind the door? No one knows. But the watch knew it was there. If you map the locations that the known watches pointed to, a pattern emerges. The sites form a rough network across Western Europe. Edinburgh, London, Paris, Vienna, Prague, Berlin, Brussels. Each site contained a demolished structure. Beneath each structure was something older, a foundation, a chamber, a sealed space, and all of them were deliberately buried, not buried by time, not buried by accident, buried by people who wanted them hidden. The churches torn down during the Reformation weren't just demolished, their foundations were broken up and filled in. The monasteries dissolved under Henry VIII weren't just abandoned, they were systematically destroyed, their crypts collapsed, their underground chambers sealed with rubble. Someone wanted to erase these sites, and someone else wanted to remember where they were. The watches were the memory. But memory isn't useful unless you can act on it. And here's where the story turns from historical curiosity to active mystery. Because the watches didn't stop working in 1900. They didn't stop in 1950. They stopped between 2000 and 2003, right around the time Malcolm Daventry disappeared. What happened in those years? What changed? Urban development. Cities across Europe underwent massive construction projects in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Old buildings were torn down, new buildings went up, underground parking structures, subway extensions, utility tunnels. Excavation reached depth that hadn't been disturbed in centuries, and every time a site was dug up, every time a foundation was poured, every time concrete sealed off another layer of history, one of the watches stopped working. The watch that pointed to Edinburgh stopped when the hotel was built. The watch that pointed to London stopped when a shopping centre broke ground in 2001. The watch that pointed to Vienna stopped when a subway line was extended in 1999. One by one, the watches went silent, not because they broke, because their targets were gone, buried under steel and concrete, permanently inaccessible. And Daventry knew this was happening. That's why he sent the letters. That's why he told the buyers to destroy the watches, because the watches were becoming evidence of something that no longer existed. And evidence without a site to verify it becomes a liability. But Daventry didn't destroy his own watches. He took them with him, which means he believed they still had value, which means he knew of sites that hadn't been disturbed yet, sites the watches could still point to. Where did he go? No one knows. But there are theories. In 2009, a hiker in the Scottish Highlands reported finding a pocket watch near a cairn. The watch was open, face up, wedged between two stones. The hiker took a photo and posted it online. The photo showed the watch hands pointing northeast. The hiker left the watch where it was. When other hikers went to find it a week later, it was gone. The cairn sits above a valley that contains the ruins of a pre-Christian settlement. No excavation has ever been done. The site is protected. But ground-penetrating radar, conducted by a university team in 2012, revealed structures beneath the ruins. Chambers, intact chambers. The university requested permission to excavate. Permission was denied. The watch, if it was one of Daventry's, pointed directly at those chambers. In 2015, a metal detectorist in Wales found a pocket watch buried in a field. The watch was corroded, non-functional, but the case was intact. Engraved on the inside of the case was a date, 1867. The detectorist sold the watch to a collector. The collector had it restored. When the restoration was complete, the collector left the watch open overnight during a new moon. The hands moved. They pointed south, toward a chapel ruin 2 miles away. The collector visited the ruin. Nothing seemed unusual, but when he researched the chapel's history, he found something interesting. The chapel was built in 1450 on the site of a much older structure. Records describe the older structure as a stone circle of unknown purpose, dismantled by church order. The stones were broken up and used to build the chapel foundation, which means whatever the stone circle marked, whatever it was built around, is still there. Under the chapel, under 600 years of graves and history, the collector still has the watch. He monitors it monthly. It still points to the chapel. He hasn't excavated. He hasn't told authorities. He's waiting. For what, he won't say. These aren't isolated incidents. There are others, watches surfacing in strange places, watches found in estate sales with no provenance, watches that work normally until the new moon, then point to locations no one has investigated. And here's the thing that should concern you. The watches are still being found, which means there are more of them than anyone documented, which means the 7 watches in the Geneva ledger weren't the only ones made. There were more commissions, more watchmakers, more clients who wanted devices that could remember what civilization was trying to forget. How many watches were made? 50, 100. And how many are still out there, sitting in drawers and display cases, waiting for someone to open them at midnight? What are they pointing to? The rational explanation is that this is all coincidence and confirmation bias. People want mystery, so they see mystery. They want old watches to have secrets, so they invent secrets. The watches are just watches. The movements people report are mechanical failures, magnetic interference, or outright fabrication. The demolished sites are just demolished sites. There's nothing underneath. No chambers, no secrets, just dirt and rocks and the remnants of old foundations that have no significance beyond their age. That explanation works. It's clean. It's reasonable. It's probably what you want to believe. But it doesn't explain the sealed sites. It doesn't explain why the Paris metro chamber was filled with concrete instead of excavated, it doesn't explain why the London staircase was buried so quickly. It doesn't explain why permission to excavate the Highland chambers was denied despite clear archaeological value. Someone doesn't want these sites opened. Someone has been preventing excavation for over a century. And the watches, whether by design or accident, point directly to what's being hidden. So what's down there? What did the builders of these structures bury that still matters enough to suppress? We don't know. But the watches do, and somewhere, right now, one of those watches is sitting on a shelf or in a drawer. And tonight, during the new moon, if someone leaves it open in the dark, the hands will move. They'll point to a location, a foundation, a chamber that hasn't been touched in centuries, and whoever sees it will have to decide, do you follow the direction? Do you investigate? Or do you do what Malcolm Daventry did and walk away, taking the secret with you? The watches are still out there, the sites are still buried, and the only people who knew what they were protecting have disappeared. If you found one of these watches, what would you do? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more suppressed history and artifacts that don't fit the official narrative, subscribe. I dig into this stuff every week, literally and figuratively. Thanks for watching. And if you have a pre-1880 pocket watch, maybe don't open it at midnight. Just a thought.